Okay, I think we'll get started. Good evening for those of you in Asia. Good afternoon, good morning for those of you in other parts of the world. My name is Navroz Dubash, and we are here for a webinar that is intended to provide an opportunity to debrief on unpack the Glasgow Climate Pact. And we're very glad that so many of you have taken the time to join us. Now, it should be fairly obvious while we're doing this. The Glasgow COP has been in the news for the last 2 weeks. It is a really significant moment in the climate debate. Lots of things happened at Glasgow that are deeply salient to the future of climate governance. But at the same time, of course, there are a fair number of people who wonder how these annual COPs really change anything on the ground. What we have done today at the Center for Policy Research is we have invited along 3 people with really deep inside knowledge of the way this process works, and who are able to kind of help us unpack the significance of some of the decisions that were taken at the COP. So we're going to try and deploy, as to the best extent possible, the enormous knowledge and skills of our panelists and try and have an engaging conversation. We'll also try and make sure we leave half an hour for interaction with those of you who've taken the time to join us. So I'm just going to actually move into the body of this relatively rapidly, starting with introducing our 3 panelists. So to begin with, we have Professor Harold Winkler from the University of Cape Town, who works on development and climate change. Harold brings both academic and policy experience. He's the editor-in-chief of the journal Climate Policy. He's a coordinating lead author for the IPCC, and he has also been part of the South African delegation. I should also add that he is very importantly the co-facilitator for input to the global stocktake going forward. So welcome, Harold. Thank you so much for joining us. We also have with us Mr. R.R. Rashmi, who is a distinguished fellow at TERI, a well-known research institute and think tank. Mr. Rashmi is a retired Indian Administrative Service officer and also a very seasoned Indian participant in the Indian climate debate, as well as a former negotiator for India. And Mr. Rashmi brings a wealth of knowledge, both from practice as well as more recently from his time as a think tank. And third, and by no means least on this panel, is my former colleague and currently professor at Oxford University, Lavanya Rajamani, whose work also spans academia and practice. For example, her book, International Climate Change Law, co-authored with 2 other stalwarts, was awarded the American Society of International Law Certificate. So it's a very recognized piece of work in international law. And she has also been a legal advisor to several governments, as well as advising and being part of the UNFCCC Secretariat. So we have a really fabulous panel, and I want to thank you all for taking the time to join us. So just a couple of logistics. When we get to the Q&A part, or in fact, well before that, please feel free to post your question in the Q&A box, and we will kind of pick out questions from there. So feel free to add your question there, not in the chat box, please. And the way we will structure this is I have asked all of our panelists to just take 5 minutes to give us a sort of a bird's eye view, a high level picture of what their takeaways were from the Glasgow experience. And then we'll dive deeper into a round of sort of unpacking, if you like. So does that sound good to the 3 of you, the panelists? Okay. All right. So maybe I can start with you, Harold, if you don't mind. Maybe if you could take 4 or 5 minutes to give us your overarching sense of Glasgow.
Thank you so much, Rashmi, and it's a pleasure to be here with you and, always engaging conversations that you moderate. So my reflections from Glasgow, one always figures out when one comes back what really happened. I think at the very high level, a lot was about 1.5, keeping 1.5 alive, and perhaps the COP did just enough to do that. And I'll give you a few of my highlights and lowlights in a moment. But you'd also raised earlier the question about what this means going forward. I think the other thing that was striking, I think a lot depends, and I think we saw a lot of shifts emerging. It depends on where you see power lying. Do you see it lying in the negotiating rooms where there are detailed text-based negotiations, out on the street where there were really very large protests, and or with business, or somewhere else, or maybe all of the above, right? Which is where I tend to think how it works. But I think it is important to understand both what happened inside and outside. I was spending most of my time inside the conference center in Glasgow. But so just to get a little bit into the meat of it, from that perspective, I'll give you a couple of highlights and a couple of lowlights in my view. And sorry, just a final overall comment. I think this was a big COP. I think Glasgow achieved, compared to other COPs, a very substantive outcome. One of the big highlights for me was that we do have a work program on the global goal for adaptation. Adaptation in Madrid, when we last met, was pretty much absent from the agenda. It has been, in a sense, outsourced to the Adaptation Committee. It now has its own agenda item and a 2-year work program. That's really important. Frankly, we don't understand the global goal for adaptation, or even people who advocate for it, as the Africa group does. We need to develop an understanding, but now there's a process to do so, and that will be very important for the global stocktake, which will assess progress not just against mitigation, but also global goal for adaptation and finance and others. I think there's a host of really good technical outcomes, probably difficult to unpack in a webinar like this, but I will just name what I see as a small package, and what was considered by some as a small package, and I think really also helps, is really fundamental. And this is about transparency, Article 6, which means we now have markets under the Paris Agreement and common timeframe, something I've worked on. After 4 or 6 years, depending on your country, finally we're able to say it's going to be 5 years. And that actually means that some of the plumbing of the system is really in place, and it can now work. Whether it will actually work depends on implementation, and there was a lot said about that in Glasgow as well. Perhaps Mr. Rashmi, and during the discussion we'll touch more on this, but just very briefly on the big final engagements around phase down of coal and phase out of inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Overall, my impression of that is it's good that the conversation is happening. At least we're starting to have the conversation in the UNFCCC process and its Paris Agreement. So those for me were some of the highlights. There were a lot of disappointments as well. There always are. It's a negotiation, but beyond that. Overall, I think there was an imbalance there's between mitigation, adaptation, and finance. While there's a lot of language about saying these three are equally important, if you look at the main decisions, you see a high-level program on mitigation ambition launched immediately and with no end date, probably up to 2030. Whereas a 2-year program on the program on adaptation, which I welcome, is only for 2 years, and it does not have ministers meeting. And then, so that is, and there was just no tangible finance at all, which is, I'm actually really sort of, as I was leaving the venue, how is it possible? It's often said, no finance, no deal. There was no real money on the table. An acknowledgement that the 100 billion, an open acknowledgement that that 100 billion has not been met. But that is a pledge that comes from Copenhagen 12 years ago, 100 billion per year. And, Frans Timmermans in the final plenary was saying, we're starting on finance. Well, okay, maybe we could have started 12 years ago. But I think there was a lot of, and he was not the only one showboating in the final plenary. But what we're seeing in real terms, what was an earlier, are millions. So literally 1% of what we need annually. And just final point, because that was my reminder that my 5 minutes are up. No finance for loss and damage. Really, really difficult discussions on loss and damage. Some operationalization, but really, and yes, we agreed in Paris that this would not lead to compensation or liability, but there are many ways of funding loss and damage that are short of compensation liability, and that just was another low light. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Harold. A really comprehensive tour, especially given the time constraints I placed on you. I do want to just make one observation just on your initial comment. I think it's really great that you mentioned sort of the insider versus outsider perspective. And I do want to acknowledge fully that the purpose of this webinar is to unpack, in a sense, what happened inside the doors, by no means thereby indicating that what happened outside the doors is not significant. And I think it's really, if we've moved as we have in the climate debate, it's because of actually the pressure that's been generated outside. And that's an important conversation. For the purpose of tractability, we've separated it out a little bit, but it's a really important point that you made. Thank you, Harold. So, Mr. Rashmi, maybe I could turn to you, including, if possible, some reflections on the Indian perspective, which again we'll come to later, but your high-level views, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Navroz. My apologies. Actually, if you look at the COP in Glasgow, I think the defining characteristic of this COP was that this was the first COP being held to implement the Paris Agreement. That is something which we all need to keep always at the back of our minds. And I thought, when I went to Glasgow, I approached it from that perspective. So I would like to say that I had a little bit of disappointment there. But of course, a number of things have been achieved there in Glasgow, as Harold has said, and I echo his thoughts that it has at least been able to resolve a number of issues which were there on the table for a long time, pretty long time since Paris. It has been able to give them a decent opening. But if you look at India, I mean, you have asked me to basically look at what India has felt in the beginning and at the end of the conference. In the beginning, I think India's position was fairly strong. And when the Prime Minister went there and made those ambitious announcements, I think everybody was taken by surprise in a way. And it did give a lot of momentum to what was going to happen at Glasgow. Coming after what China and US and other major developed G20 countries had announced and done, what India did was actually it brought a lot of fresh air and hope into the whole process. So India, I did feel that India had opened the its gambit from a position of strength, and things were turning in its favor. Of course, towards the end, the coal issue came up, and that tried to change the conversation completely and take it in a different direction altogether. I'll come to that shortly. But let me first deal with the ambition expressed there in the announcements made by the Prime Minister. And we can all realize what stupendous targets he has set for the country. That is something, if you look at the nuts and bolts of what systems need to be put in place to achieve those targets, then you look at you really get surprised by the kind of efforts that need to be put in to achieve them. It's not easy, certainly not easy in terms of the 50% energy from renewable sources, and most of the experts feel that this is an uphill task. But considering the fact that he has quantified the goal, apart from giving a goal in terms of proportion of the electricity generation, energy generation, he has also given a goal of 500 gigawatts by 2030. So if you combine these two, this is a stupendous uphill goal, and India will need all its might and resources perhaps to achieve this. Given this background, and then of course he capped it by the net zero goal announcement in 2070, which was another something which took everyone by surprise. Not that everyone is happy. There were many correspondents from different journals which were asking me, why is it that India is 20 years behind the rest of the world? Well, of course, I will try and answer this subsequently, but the very fact that net zero goal has been announced on top of 50% energy from renewables is quite a major step that India has taken. So this was the opening scenario at Glasgow, which I think propelled India into a leadership position amongst the G20 countries. Even otherwise, India has been rated very well amongst the G20 countries, generally for its exceptional performance on the NDCs which it has put out. The only disturbing, I would say, assessment which had come out just before Glasgow was the climate tracker assessment that India's NDCs are highly insufficient. But that was entirely because of the change in the framework and the terms on which the assessments are carried out. They have adopted a different method. So, but that was not bothering anyone at that point of time in Glasgow. But as it proceeded, I think it lost a little bit of its steam. For example, the 2030 goals were not discussed at all. And that was the primary task of the Glasgow conference. So in my view, I think the ambitious goals for climate in 2030 have been given a short shrift. I don't want to blame anything on the COP presidency, but I think the COP presidency had its own priorities set, and coal was one of its priorities. I think it lost its momentum because of that distraction. I think we have lost at least a year or two in trying to gain the momentum and the focus on 2030 targets. And I hope we are able to get back on track, at least by the global stock take. And I would be happy if Aral contributes his own might to this whole process, because we need to close this emissions gap. We need to live up to the expectation which NDC synthesis report has put out for us. So we need to do all that is possible to close this gap, at least in the next 3 to 4 years, through more ambitious NDCs, where some of the G20 countries have tried to do their best. A lot needs to be done. Since you have asked me this question on coal, I think, in my view, I beg to disagree with Harald. Is there that coal question need not be discussed in a COP text because it's a sectoral issue. It's we have all along for the last 20 years we have always been resisting a discussion on sectoral technology issues at the global level, because they not only detract from the strategic question of how low carbon emission development can take place, but also from the fact that they marginalize the issues of the resources and technologies. This was another disappointment that I felt, that in the whole of discussions which took place at Glasgow, technology was never mentioned even once. Of course, I'll complete it very soon. But I must say that it was India's Prime Minister who did try to raise this issue of technology through his One Sun, One Grid, One World, One Sun, One Grid initiative. But nobody took up this cue, and there was hardly any further momentum on technology. So I'll stop here. So I do feel that the Glasgow conference achieved a lot, at least as far as the rule book is concerned. But in terms of more strategic questions, I think it has, questions will certainly be raised on the process that took place there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Rashmi. I think given us lots to talk about. Just want to point out that as somebody in the chat has also commented, there was some question about whether the Prime Minister's statement referred to energy or capacity, and I think the MEA later clarified it, they meant capacity, but it's something we can come back to. So 50% of capacity, not energy. But we'll come back to that. Lavanya, could I turn to you for 5 minutes or so of high-level comments?
Thank you, Navroz, and thank you, Mr. Rashmi and Harold. It's always enlightening listening to you, and it's always a pleasure to be back at CPR, even though it's virtually, and in this instance, and especially for our annual COP debriefs. I agree with both Mr. Rashmi and Harold that Glasgow actually was a very substantive COP, and there were some very substantial outcomes that emerged from Glasgow. I also agree with Mr. Rashmi that the coal issue was something of a distraction. While it's great to have it in the text, I think it ended up being, as one of our colleagues characterized it, a bit of a sideshow. In terms of substantive outcomes, I think the most significant outcome of Glasgow, as Harold has already indicated, and Mr. Rashmi also sort of endorsed this position, is the conclusion of the Paris rulebook. This is not what the media reportage focused on, but this is really the big ticket item from Glasgow. Most of the rulebook, as many of us know, was concluded a few years ago in Katowice, but there were few sort of issues that had lingered and had proven intractable until now. And these were, as Harold has mentioned, rules relating to markets, rules relating to common timeframes, or an agreement on a common timeframe for NDCs, and transparency. And concluding rules on all of these three issues in particular was hugely significant. On rules relating to markets, we have now rules that allow adjustments to avoid double counting, ensuring there's some integrity in the emissions trading systems that are set up. They limit the extent to which CDM credits can be carried over, also levy a charge in the case of Article 6.4 mechanism for adaptation. So there are sort of very substantive outcomes in relation to emissions trading, and at least the rules for markets. Common timeframes as well. The agreement on a common timeframe of 5 years allows for more dynamic target setting, action delivery and accountability, as well as comparability across NDCs. And finally, the rules relating to transparency also allow for clarity, transparency, and comparability. So the completion of the rule book really signals the start of the full implementation of the Paris Agreement. At least it's poised for full implementation and operationalization. And that is the most significant outcome of the Glasgow COP. There is, however, one other less tangible, but nevertheless significant learning, in my view, from COP26. And this is that the logic of the Paris Agreement approach to treaties design is actually playing itself out far beyond expectations in relation to mitigation, but not in relation to finance adaptation, finance and adaptation in particular support. And in this process, it's actually further institutionalizing the unfairness in the regime. And I'm happy to sort of elaborate on this with details in relation to paragraph numbers of the text, but I'm sure Navrose will steer me away from that. But if I could, at a high level, indicate why I'm saying this. So the Paris Agreement, as we know, represented a step change in the approach to treaties design, because the design was one of sort of starting broad, making sure all states are on board, but with very shallow commitments, and then over time, sort of iteratively increasing ambition to sort of meet the global goals, especially in relation to temperature. The jury was actually out and is out on whether this would actually happen, because it's based on very fuzzy notions like transparency and peer pressure. And it's clear from Glasgow that, at least as far as target setting and mitigation is concerned, even if not in terms of implementation or delivery, target setting, this is happening. And in fact, it's happening at a stunning rate, right? Even the goalposts have been shifted. The temperature goalpost has shifted from well below 2 degrees centigrade to now very much a 1.5 degrees centigrade target, which was just aspirational in the Paris Agreement. The net zero goal has also moved from the second half of the century, which is what Article 4.1 of the Paris Agreement refers to mid-century, thanks to the IPCC report and the narratives that have been built up around it. And the ambition cycle has been speeded up. The Glasgow Climate Pact requests states to come back next year with updated NDCs. These are not 5-year cycles anymore. We're going to have annual cycles for NDC updates if at least the Glasgow Pact is anything to go by. And there are annual synthesis reports being required now. And this needs to be placed in the context. So all this sort of achievement on mitigation needs to be placed in the context of the fact that we have no substantive outcomes on finance and support, as Harold has indicated. Most of the outcomes on those fronts are in terms of more process. And even the 2020, $100 billion per year commitment will not actually be met until 2023, a matter of deep regret in the Glasgow Climate Pact. But this, of course, we know that $100 billion per year is minuscule compared to what's actually needed, but it's proving totemic, of the unfairness that is actually being institutionalized in this regime. So ratcheting up pressure and mitigation ambition with no reflection or consideration of, or actually even avenues for consideration of each state's fair share in the context of all these breached promises on finance and support, is just baking in the unfairness into the system. And there are illustrations that I can take from the text. So if you look at paragraph 29, which requests parties to revisit and strengthen NDCs in 2022 to align themselves with the Paris Agreement temperature goal, as Harold and I discussed earlier as well in a separate conversation, how can we actually do this without a sense of what each state's fair share is? It's self-determined. So what that means is they'll be subject to pressure, the kind of pressure that India was under at the end of the COP. Paragraph 32, which encourages parties to embed net zero in the Paris Agreement architecture in Article 419 towards just transition to net zero emissions by or around mid-century, refers to taking into account different national circumstances and does have a reference to just transition, but it does not have a reference to different peaking years, which we find in Article 4.1. So it's an undifferentiated net zero, self-determined. It's also instructive, I think, that the earlier version of that text actually contained a phrase relating to net zero, transition to net zero strategies, actually setting out pathways with plans and policies. And that was taken out of the final text. So which goes to the sort of alignment between long-term net zero and short-term NDCs that Mr. Rashmi was talking about. So we have these long-term NDCs in the picture. We are not going to put forward pathways with policies and plans to getting to those net zero from NDCs, which clearly suggests that states don't want scrutiny. At least some states don't want scrutiny of these net zero targets. So, so just to conclude my probably more than 5 minutes now, I think the logic of the Paris Agreement in terms of mitigation is really sort of working itself out and at a stunning rate. However, it's also institutionalizing the unfairness, which, the writing was on the wall in Paris, but I think it's now being baked into the system. Thank you.
Thank you, Lavanya. I figured you might sneak a couple of paragraph references in there, which is perfectly acceptable. I always learn from the paragraph references. And thank you for that big overarching picture. I'd like to kind of probe this very clearly articulated view a little bit further and maybe ask Harold to interrogate it, because Harold was actually quite terse in his opening comments and welcome a chance for him to elaborate. We've heard critiques, most notably from Greta Thunberg outside, that this is a lot of blah, blah, blah. We've heard from all of you that actually the Paris Agreement and the completion of the rule book lends a lot more significance and kind of a structure to what nations can do. And I think Lavanya used the phrase poised for full implementation. Now, I guess the question perhaps from the outside might be, that's wonderful. It's poised for full implementation. We have a framework for knowing if for significant action, if states are willing to undertake significant action. But are they in fact willing to undertake significant action? I mean, it's great to elect a scaffolding, but then somebody has to climb the scaffolding. And so I guess that's really the question, whether erecting the scaffolding at this stage is enough, or does there have to be some way of trying to get states to climb that scaffolding? And on the mitigation point, I guess I would also, and I'll give you a chance to come back on this, Lavanya, the stunning ambition has really been, and this is taking a page from Mr. Rashmi's book, has really been about more and more ambitious statements of intent. And if anything, a backing away from the short-term actions required to get to that, towards accomplishing that intent, as well as providing the support, as you noted and Harold noted, for others to do so. So I think it'd be worth interrogating this kind of blah 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 critique a little bit more. Maybe I can start with Harold on that.
Thanks, Navros, and thank you also, Mr. Rashmi and Lavanya, for excellent inputs. I agree with so much that has been said. That is a very strong critique from our side, but I think it does, and I think it's valid. So just from the IPCC, we learn that yes, while the increase in mitigation ambition, I completely agree with the unfairness being baked in, but just the mitigation ambition, yes. So the updated NDCs give us another 4 to 5 gigatons more ambition. That's a lot. Closes the emission gap maybe by a fifth, something like that, maybe less. So we still, the whole thing is still true. It's been true. What is required by science and equity is really huge, dramatic, very fast, deep change. What the politics allows, which is what you see in the text, is much more limited, and even those targets. And so I think sometimes the blah, blah, blah critique misses, well, firstly, it creates a binary. It's not about what happens outside or inside, it's about what happens outside and inside, right? I think that, and the pressure is, it's useful to have that pressure in my personal view. But it reflects often not an understanding of what is being set up here, and the critical norm setting function and setting in place the scaffolding, as Lavanya has described it. There was a lot of mention that I heard in Glasgow of implementation, and that we need to think of implementation as being part of ambition, and what you just said, Navros, as well. Even if we set higher targets, I mean, okay, so those who haven't done so, there's another paragraph, right? Basically pointing at Australia and others who really just, you can't credibly say that target is, a highest level of ambition. But even we all really need to do more very rapidly, and start implementing. And it's really also completely agree, Mr. Rashmi. I think the initial reaction to the announcement by Prime Minister Modi, some question about why 2070, but the real issue is that it provides a long-term perspective on the very impressive near-term action that needs to be done. And if that gets done, then what's happening, my view is that what's happening in the process moves us in the right direction. Is it enough? Clearly not. And so the outside critique just points that out. And also, last point, coming back to my earlier last point, in the second week, the messaging from the Climate Action Network, which you know very well, Navros, was consistently about loss and damage and finance for loss and damage. And there is just zero, right? There is nothing.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Harold. Maybe we can have a rapid fire, because I do want to leave time to come back to some of the India questions and so on. Maybe a rapid fire response or elaboration from Lavanya and Ms. Rashmi in that order.
Thank you, Navros. I completely agree, of course, with all the panelists and you that there isn't any alignment of the short-term NDCs with the long-term net zero targets. So I'm not suggesting that actual implementation is being ratcheted up. Clearly, it's not. Action on the ground, sort of real action is not being ratcheted up in the way that the Paris Agreement would envisage. What I'm suggesting is that the design is premised on sort of iterative increases in target setting. And that is happening, and that process has been short-circuited even. How real those targets are, how implementable those targets are, how much delivery there will be on those targets is a separate question, a very important question. There is and should be emphasis on implementation, of course. And I think, sort of going back to the sort of question that you asked in relation to blah, 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 there's always, with those kinds of critiques, there's always concern that their expectations of the UN negotiating process might be unreasonable, because at the end of the day, the UN negotiating process is 197 states, and any agreement is going to be located in the sweet spot between the red lines of 197 states. We're not, if we can get, and I think Glasgow is a substantive outcome, if we can get what we get from Glasgow, and I can sort of indicate at least a couple of things that I think were quite positive coming out of Glasgow, in addition to the rule book, even in the Climate Pact. I think that's a substantive outcome. I think it does go beyond blah, blah, blah. Is it going to resolve the climate crisis? Are we going to be on a pathway to 1.5 at the end of Glasgow? No. But if that was your expectation going in, then that misunderstands the UN negotiating process, honestly. And the role that it plays, it's not just the UN negotiating process. It's a part of the larger sort of governance and regulatory architecture and action architecture for climate change. So it plays a small part, and it played an important part in Glasgow. And I'd just like to highlight one aspect, for instance, to make this point. On net zero targets, for instance, in the run-up to Glasgow, we had many net zero targets that were all over. We didn't know there were carbon targets for net zero carbon or net zero greenhouse gas emissions. There was no accountability. There was no credibility to many of them, and certainly unfairness as well. What we do find in the Glasgow Climate Pact is an effort to integrate that into the Paris Agreement architecture, so that there will be some transparency around it. There's even going to be a synthesis report on these net zero targets that will be integrated into the long-term low greenhouse gas development strategies of states. States are encouraged to put in these. There were always hooks in the Paris Agreement to do this, but the Glasgow Climate Pact actually encourages states to do that. So to the extent that states do that, we now have these net zero targets, which were just blah, blah, blah outside the process, that are now going to be subject to some level of scrutiny. It may not be robust review of these net zero targets, but at least there'll be some transparency around them, and there'll be some questions asked about them. So I think there's definitely more than blah, blah, blah.
So I guess the underlying model is, get these statements out and then use the mechanisms of Paris, in a sense, to ratchet up and try and make them more implementable and serious and transparent. And that proof, I think we'll have to see how that plays out in the coming years. Mr. Rashmi, did you want to come in briefly on this one? And then I want to turn to India for a little while.
I thank you. I'll be very brief, and I entirely agree with both Lavanya and Haral on this issue that it's not the Glasgow conference was not a complete blah, blah, blah. I'm sure there are a number of things which we can all pick out according to our own areas of interest. A number of things were done, and it has delivered a lot. And the general disappointment outside the conference amongst the youth and some of the activists was, of course, I don't deny them their emotional outpouring. They are our future, and they're concerned about our future. What they do feel that the political leadership of the world is not acting as fast or as urgently as it should. So I think that point is absolutely valid, and then it's partly reflected in the way the conference has played out. We have spent a lot of time in issues of long-term strategy rather than immediate actions, short-term actions, and that is what is bothering everyone, including the activists. And I think rightly so. We need to focus or refocus our attention on the immediate actions that we need to take within the given resources, within the technological choices that are available to us. So it should not be simply a matter of 2050 strategy. It should be a matter of 2025, 2030, 2035 strategy actions, and they need to be spelled out, they need to be monitored, and the countries need to be held to account for that. And the Paris Agreement, as Lavanya has said, allows or provides us those tools by which we can do this.
Great, thank you, Mr. Rashmi. I hear in what you're saying in part that ultimately the decision for action is going to be something taken in national capitals and indeed at subnational levels. And the question is more scrutiny at the international level, are more defined rules at the international level, how much will those actually shape national actions versus how much will they be driven by national politics? For example, how much more likely does it make that Mr. Biden will pass his Build Back Better bill, for example? And I think that's really an open question and something that we'll have to wait and see the answer on. I personally feel that national politics ultimately will probably drive the actual implementation of many of these pledges. But I think that's a very good pivot then to digging a little bit deeper into the India story. And of course, Mr. Rashmi has given a point of view that India's targets are actually quite ambitious. There has been pushback in the media and also on this list here saying that, look, if you with that clarification on generation versus capacity, that in fact changes the perception of that target. Certainly the fact that there was a net zero target was unexpected and certainly gave India the headlines, including sort of diplomatic kudos in the first week. So I think it's worth sort of digging into the India story a little bit deeper And maybe in very un-Indian fashion, maybe we should first give the word to one area where we have an outsider, which is Harold, on the India story. And you know, how did the India story look from your vantage point? And then we'll come back to Mr. Rashmi and Lavanya.
Well, let me be very brief on this. I mean, I think it's much more useful to have the discussion domestically, and I agree with you. I think a lot of the politics is shaped domestically. But my initial reaction was surprise, as Mr. Rashmi has said. It was 27. You know, is this back to China plus 10, which we've heard somewhere before? But really, that isn't very impressive near-term targets. And if those indeed, if institutions are set up and resources mobilized to actually implement that, that would be big. And so I think it also took outsiders like me some time to digest what this actually meant. But I'd rather listen to the discussion. Thanks, Naval.
Okay, no, fair enough, Harold. So maybe we can come back to either Lavanya or Mr. Rashmi and maybe unpack how this was received diplomatically overseas, how it was received in India, and how it was received by business. But also, if we could comment on the fact that something that I confess I have mentioned in my writings on this, that there was a lot of uncertainty about exactly what was said and what, in fact, that means. So the confusion over generation versus capacity, whether the net zero was GHGs or CO2. And a prime minister can't get into these details in a speech, but subsequently, certainly it could be clarified, and we're waiting for that clarification. So it's worth maybe doing one more round of conversation on this, and both exploring the implications of that ambiguities and how we know how ambitious it is. Another part of that pledge, the 1 billion ton reduction, there was also uncertainty and continues to be some uncertainty around that. So maybe we can speak to those uncertainties, what that means for ambition, and then how this was read both domestically and internationally. Either of you who would like to pick this up?
Let me go there first.
Okay, please.
Rose, let me try and sort of clarify our thoughts about this 500 gigawatt and 50% question. If you simply look at the number, 50% of energy from renewables in 2030, and if you include 500 gigawatts there, obviously, I mean, by simple arithmetic, it means that you will need to have electricity generation capacity, or at least the total energy generation capacity in the system, at least to the extent of 1,000 gigawatts. Is it doable? Is it feasible? Today, we are at 308, 310 around gigawatt capacity. So in a matter of 8 years or 9 years, you have to really make a jump of almost 3.5 times in terms of creating a capacity. Capacity alone, forget about the generation. So this is really stupendous. And I think both are true. If you are able to really put that much of capacity in place, I think we might be able to achieve even 50% generation, depending on what you actually do.
So, sorry, Mr. Rashmi, but just because it can get confusing, I think the implication, however, of what you say is that if we get to 1,000 gigawatts and 50% of it is renewable, then we would have to, in fact, vastly increase our coal as well, to more than doubling where we are today. So that's the confusion, really. Is that?
Indeed, this 500 gigawatt, you have to look at this the efficiency terms as well. I mean, it's not simply enough to create capacity. You need to create actual generation capacity, which would not happen if you have only the current technologies available to you. So therefore, you need to, the coal will rise. I mean, the minister has already clarified that the coal will rise in absolute capacity, as in terms of proportion, it will go down over a period of time. And this is already happening. The coal as a proportion of electricity generation has remained static in the last 5 years and is unlikely to rise further. But the absolute amount will certainly increase if you don't create alternative systems of energy. If you don't produce green hydrogen, or if you don't have access to any other sources of energy like nuclear or hydro, you are bound to get caught in a system where coal will rise. So these are inevitable questions, and we can interpret it either way, depending on what you really want to achieve.
Okay. All right. Thanks. I think certainly it would help a great deal when something written is out there, because I think you could run the numbers. In fact, a few different ways is my understanding. But Lavanya, would you like to come in on how this was seen and kind of the politics of of shaping the perception of India and over the course of the 2 weeks?
Sure, Navroz. Just briefly on that, I think, I had had conversations with various even heads of delegations before Glasgow, and nobody expected a net zero target from India. One of our friends actually suggested that it would be a shocker if there was a net zero target from India, and sure enough, there was a net zero target from India. So there was a lot of surprise. There's also a lot of uncertainty, of course, as you've already indicated, especially in relation to whether it's a CO2 or a GHG target. But the short-term targets, as Mr. Rashmi said, is far more substantial, and the focus was not on those short-term targets. And I think it's a reflection of how the process has evolved and how the narrative has evolved, that we are generating pressure on states to take on these long-term net zero targets that actually there are no pathways to those net zero targets from where the current NDCs are. Those pathways have not been thought through. There isn't a sense of what policies and actions will get us there. But the focus is all on those net zero targets, and that's that's how you're signaling virtue in this debate today. And I think, like I've said before, one of the outcomes of Glasgow that I think is actually quite positive is to sort of integrate it into the architecture and ask for some alignment between the NDCs and the long-term net zero targets. This is also something which is increasingly going to be taken up in courts. There have been a couple of cases already, including the German Federal Constitutional Court case in Neubauer in April this year, where the German courts actually indicated that there were intergenerational concerns with doing this, with shifting, taking short-term actions that are relatively unambitious, or at least do not align with the long-term targets, because then you're essentially shifting the burden to future generations. And those future generations will have fewer rights and fewer freedoms as a result of the shift of sort of burdens to future generations in terms of mitigation, but also in terms of carbon dioxide removal. So a lot of the pathways that we're looking at going forward are pathways that are not, since they're not linear, they don't go directly from the NDCs that states have to the net zero targets. It's clear that we're going to emit much more than we should be emitting, and that we're going to have to start removing a lot more to get to net zero. And that is going to be more expensive to do as well. And that burden is also being shifted to future generations. So there are serious concerns with this overall sort of narrative shift that we've seen in the climate negotiations, where the focus is so much more on virtue signaling on 2070 or 2060 than it is on short-term NDCs. And we know for the latest updated synthesis report that we are currently on track, if there's full implementation of NDCs, to 13.7% GHGs above 2010 levels by 2030. And according to the IPCC 1.5 special report, we should be at 45% CO2 below 2010 by 2030 if we have to have a limited overshoot sort of scenario towards 1.5. So we're clearly not where we need to be. We're not moving there anytime soon. So why all this virtue signaling for 2070 and 2060? Thank you.
No, thank you, Lavanya. And in fact, your analysis would then prompt the reaction that maybe there's a relationship between the overachievement of the Paris Agreement mitigation side, and the fact that this overachievement is actually for targets that no living politician can possibly ever be held accountable to. And it really raises the question about then the design of the Paris Agreement, or at least the way in which it provides the scope for a kind of a shift to the long term versus a more immediate focus, at least a complementary focus on the short term. Before we have another 10 minutes or so before we get into some of the questions, and I think we might usefully turn back to diving a little deeper into what came out of Glasgow, without, of course, pretending that we have in any ways sorted out or put a bow on top of perceptions of India's role. But I will maybe just take a minute to say that clearly the 2070 target took everybody by surprise. Perhaps there could have been more attention to the 2030 targets, and I think everybody would have liked to have seen more meaningful engagement with those. It will be useful to see what comes out formally in trying to understand exactly what it means for the future of India's energy sector. And we also have, as Mr. Rashmi said, in the background, groups like the Climate Action Tracker, providing certain sort of judgments that again depend on an interpretation, and we now see other trackers, including one from India, which is very welcome. And I think there's a whole separate conversation, in fact, to be had about the game of tracking and the basis on which these tracking efforts happen. And we will all be writing to Harold in his co-facilitator role about the inadequacy as yet of global agreement around how we know and how we track ambition and fairness. But it's clearly a big sort of hole that remains, in a sense, in this process. But with that, maybe we can pivot to a few minutes in one round of deeper comments on some aspects of what came out of Glasgow, particularly focusing perhaps on loss and damage and adaptation, which, as all three of you have mentioned, and certainly Lavanya and Harold, are in a sense underplayed compared to the mitigation component in various ways. Given the political pressure that was inadequately met with a response, what is the scope for both these agenda items in coming COPs? Anybody want to put up their hand on this one? Maybe maybe okay. All three of you.
I'll take that.
All three of you can go.
I also just very briefly to mention on the tracking part before responding to your question, was delighted to hear during Glasgow that there's now a new climate equity monitor by some of your colleagues in India that you know very well. And I think that's a real counterbalance to most of these, almost all of the existing trackers are from the global north. And so I think it's really important that there's other information and you can compare. But on loss and damage and adaptation, I mean, as I think we've all emphasized, there's a real imbalance and this inequity being baked in. So on adaptation, I think it is very significant that there is now a work program on the global goal for adaptation. As I said, that will help with the global stocktake, because the stocktake will, which starts now and it concludes in 2022 and conclude in 2023. It will assess against all the long-term goals, including this one. But because we don't understand the goal itself very well, a work program on it will be very helpful. In addition to that, we really need a lot more work on also understanding what contributions towards that goal look like. And that is very different in mitigation to adaptation. In mitigation and in finance, you can add up tons in mitigation and dollars or any other currency in finance, but adaptation isn't like that. The contributions will be different, and we need much more work and methodological work, in my view, on metrics, both qualitative and quantitative metrics. That would put us into a better position to say, here is where we are, maybe in a composite view of the world. Are we making progress to actually achieving the global goal for adaptation? And when we get there, they are really interesting, and I will get slightly textual here briefly as well. Article 714 in the Paris Agreement is most detailed set out of what is to be assessed in relation to Article 7 deals with adaptation. So there are issues like recognition of efforts, which many countries and even poorest countries are making with very limited resources, which puts a very different spin on asking for money. And also the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation and support for adaptation. It is very clear also that the support is a fraction, less than a percentage of what the goal is, what the current floor goal of 100 billion per year is. There's a new goal being negotiated. There's a new report on determination of needs. If memory serves me correctly, saying 1.3 trillion, but that the Standing Committee on Finance has issued. So if we were getting half of that for adaptation, the numbers that were being mentioned in terms of doubling finance were in the millions. We're talking trillions. These are 6 orders of magnitude. Okay, 6 but at least 3 or 4 orders of magnitude too little, completely inadequate. And just expressing regret, deep regret, 12 years later is frankly just doesn't wash. Loss and damage is almost worse. So what we did get out of Glasgow, in my view, and I don't follow this closely, is that there's some operationalization of something called the Santiago network for loss and damage. There's been a very divisive discussion in the executive committee, but the Santiago network now has defined functions, and there's a process to further develop basically how it will operate. But no real money, as I've already mentioned, and the sensitivity here, just to perhaps explain, it was agreed in Paris that in a paragraph of the decision adopting the agreement, that loss and damage would not lead to compensation and liability. But to repeat the point again, there are many ways of funding that are not compensation and liability, and that is not being looked at seriously. And what that means in the end is that those who are most vulnerable, which is generally poor communities and people everywhere, will suffer the most, and they will pay. They will pay in some cases with their lives or their livelihoods. So that is a deep injustice, and that is not being addressed. And increasingly, how we actually reflect equity in this process is very unclear. It clearly needs to be different to what it was pre-Paris. We're no longer working on Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 basis, list-based differentiation, but is equity still relevant? Absolutely, and that must be. And I will quote some of Lavanya's words, which I always liked, is that I think equity should be used as a sword rather than a shield. We should use it to actually raise ambition, but raise ambition in relation to mitigation, ambition, and finance including for adaptation and loss and damage.
Okay, great. Thank you, Harold. I want to make sure we leave time for the Q&A. So maybe we can have very, very quick interventions, if you don't mind, from Mr. Rashmi and then Lavanya.
Yes, I'll be very brief. Thank you, Navroz. I agree with Harold completely that the central question at the heart of this problem is the finance. And mitigation finance doesn't bother me. I think the corporates and the industry and the governments can find enough resources within a regulatory system, and within the financial system that is available to finance mitigation activities. But in case of adaptation and loss and damage, the central issue is how to raise finance. And obviously, the government budgets are not enough. Neither for mitigation nor for adaptation. So I was a little disappointed that despite the fact that we closed the rulebook in Glasgow, we could not decide on the share of proceeds. This is one way in which we could have asked the carbon markets to contribute to adaptation fund, in addition to what the governments contribute. But so we essentially need predictable sources of finance for meeting adaptation needs and covering the losses and damages. So we need to create alternative systems. So what is it that we can do? This is what we need to look at. And I hope in the global stocktake process, we create enough systems within the Paris Agreement, which contribute funds for the purpose of adaptation on a predictable basis. Carbon market is one possibility. The other possibility is that we look at innovative instruments innovative financial instruments, which in terms of guarantees or credit refinance, which we link with viability funding, and then somehow the government's protected through national funds. Global funds, I do not pin much hope on them, but national funds, I think, can be supplemented with this kind of resources which we generate from the carbon markets. This is what I wanted to say at the moment.
Thank you, Mr. Rashmi. I think that's very, very helpful. Clearly, there's a lot of agreement about the importance of finance, particularly for adaptation. Lavanya?
Yeah, thank you, Navroz. I'm sort of enthusiastic agreement with Harold and Mr. Rashmi on most of the points that they made. So I'm just going to add a few words on loss and damage. I think, as Harold said, there has been further operationalization of the Santiago network on loss and damage. And you see, again, I'm going to have to sort of refer to some paragraphs, but you see references in the pact in paragraph 64 and 67 to financing of this. And it's an old trick that drafters use. It doesn't identify who has to provide funds. So sort of decides to provide funds to support technical assistance, but doesn't actually say who provides those funds. And then you see later on in another paragraph that it urges all, including private sources, to provide enhanced support. So it's not just a story of finance, is not just a story of inadequate finance and not inadequate finance from developed countries. It's also a question. It's also an issue of diffusion of responsibilities for provision of finance, including in relation to loss and damage, not just in relation to mitigation and adaptation. What the Glasgow Pact did was to establish a Glasgow dialogue between parties, relevant organizations, and stakeholders to discuss arrangements for funding. So it was a process outcome. They're discussing arrangements for funding rather than actually provision of funding. But it's a 2-year program. And in the final plenary, the Alliance of Small Island States made it very clear that they see this dialogue as a key step towards the establishment of a loss and damage finance facility to be concluded next year. Loss and damage is an issue that small island states have put on the table, and they have been sort of pursuing this right from the very start of the negotiations from the early 90s. I think they might be coming to the end of their patience on this issue. And we see that in developments outside the climate process. For instance, Antigua and Barbuda and Tuvalu established a commission for small island states and international law to bring a case before the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea. This happened, or it was announced in the first week of the COP. In the run-up to the COP, Vanuatu announced its initiative to approach the General Assembly to request an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on rights and responsibilities of states. Because ultimately, the Paris Agreement is not a one-stop shop in terms of international legal architectures for loss and damage and for climate governance. There are customary international obligations. There are other treaties that states have ratified and are party to, including human rights instruments. And rights and responsibilities of states have to be seen in the context of that overall architecture and of international law. And that's what these international legal fora can do, is to go beyond just the realpolitik of what happens in these negotiations and what states are willing to do. It goes beyond that to what states are required to do under international law and what responsibilities they have in international law. And I think that's the shift we're beginning to see with loss and damage. And I think climate litigation, again, is going to lead the way here. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lavanya. We actually have a question from the floor directly on this, and I'm going to call on Pranav Ganeshan to ask the question. I think it's aimed directly at you. Pranav, can you go ahead?
Yeah, so I think my question was regarding the last minute change of the language from phase out of unabated fossil fuels from phase out to phase down. And I was kind of worried about the legal implications that can have downstream when climate change litigation. So for instance, you have cases like People versus Arctic Oil in Norway. You have cases like Gloucester Resources in Australia. Very recently, there was also the case of Anjali Sharma in the New South Wales Land and Environmental Court, which is a specialized environmental tribunal, where the court essentially ordered the government to stop expanding a coal project. Now, the specific question that I have is, will this change in language and will the COP26 cover decision, can it be used by governments as a tool to justify permitting new sort of projects and sanctioning new developments in the area of fossil fuels?
Okay, great. Thank you, Pranav. Lavanya, would you like to respond?
Thank you. Well, first of all, lovely to see you, Pranav. Pranav was a student of mine last year on the BCL in Oxford, a star student, I should say. So the question is a very important one, but I'd like to put this in context. As we know, and as Pranav knows, Conference of Parties decisions are not binding unless there's explicit authority in any case. So that's the larger context. These decisions are at best soft law. And we have seen in national court decisions that it is the text of the treaties that are used rather than Conference of Parties decisions. And to the extent the text of the treaties are used, many courts, including some of the courts' decisions that he is alluding to, actually go beyond the text of the treaties. So, for instance, in the Article 2 sort of purpose long-term temperature goal, which is heavily caveated and is aspirational in the text of the Paris Agreement, many national courts have actually read that as a goal without an interrogation of, how caveated that goal is. So I think national courts will go beyond. They will look for signals from the text rather than tie themselves to the exact language of the text. At least that's the way most courts have looked at these texts emerging from conferences and certainly from the treaty itself, the Paris Agreement.
Great. Thank you very much. We have a question from Abhijit Banerjee. Are you there?
Yes. Thank you, Navros, for inviting me on. It's always a pleasure to attend CPR events, although I can't. There's so many I can't attend all of them. I wanted to ask a question on U.S. politics, since Navros touched upon it a little bit. We know the U.S. is the biggest player in terms of whether diplomatically, in terms of historic emissions, and unless the U.S. really leads the way, other countries may feel hard pressed to make really significant cuts. We also know that the U.S. politics is dominated by science denying Republicans. The Republican Party has transformed into a science denying cult, so to speak. And for those who follow U.S. politics, the structure of U.S. Congress is such that even though this science denying view is a minority view, they will always be overrepresented in Congress. So it would be, regardless of who wins the presidential election, the composition of Congress may well be on the balance, and in the next election, Democrats might even lose a few seats. So regardless of what the president...
I'm going to ask you to just quickly turn it to the question, if you don't mind, so we can get more questions.
So regardless of what the progressive president might pledge, what are the prospects of US taking really painful actions, going forward compared to previous actions, which were like simply switching from coal to gas? Now, as we move over to painful actions, if the US doesn't take it on, then what is the prospects of other countries taking on painful cuts unilaterally? Thank you.
Okay, so would anybody like to address this, Harold or Mr. Rashmi? If the US, and there was another question on a similar vein from Chelarajan on the chat, that if US politics kind of slows things down, or US politics get in the way of Build Back Better and other actions, are the countries going to pick up the slack or be asked to pick up the slack?
Oh, well, thank you, Navrosh. I can't agree more. I mean, US has always been the leader as far as the global politics is concerned in the area of climate change, as well as every other sector. So it's important that the US remains engaged in the process. Joe Biden's administration has infused a lot of hope in the process and a lot of dynamism in this whole process. So his personal commitment is absolutely above board, and there is absolutely no doubt. But there are legal issues within the US legal system. They will have to find ways of overcoming that. And I hope Joe Biden administration remains committed fully, despite the fact that they may have certain setbacks within Senate, and they may find it difficult to push the program which they have outlined. I think as far as international commitment is concerned, it's not likely to be dampened simply because of the American politics. As long as the political direction is clear, I think we will stay true to what the others have said.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Rashmi. We have another question from Jayaraman. Jayaraman, would you like to, as briefly as possible, please summarize your question for the panel?
Thank you for this opportunity. And of course, all among friends, it's good to listen to your opinions after the dust settles a bit. But unfortunately, Navroz, I don't have a question. I have two comments, short ones. But if that doesn't fit your format, I'm quite happy to withdraw. It's up to you.
Jairam, I think it's well within your powers to make the comment and ask for observations on it, which would then serve as a question. But
Yeah,
briefly,
okay.
please. Briefly, please.
Yeah, very briefly. One, I think the strategy of NDCs on the one side and LTS on the other, the long-term net zero target, is not accidental. Now, this is not to say, have a kind of conspiracy theory about how the whole thing was intended, but I think it is playing out itself as a pincer. Now, WRI is a leader in this business, and I really encourage you to read their blog, because they had a blog on LTS, and they said how LTS must be updated periodically. We've got both in the cover decision, and that's a hell of a lot. So I think this is the strategy. You force immediate targets, and you force also long-term targets. So it's a double squeeze from both sides, number one. Number two, developed countries began with deliberately weak targets so that then they can update it, they look better. Okay. And I do not think now in retrospect, this was accidental. Third thing is, this is not the only instrument, and it will take me immediately to finance. This is not accidental because the hammer blows. So you have sort of two pincers and a frontal thrust, which is Article 21C. Article 21C is disaster for Africa. I think India can survive Article 21C. By Article 21C, I guess maybe just quickly for the audience, this says finance flows must be aligned to the goals of the Paris Agreement, which immediately has now been interpreted across all multilateral development banks, by the United States, by Europe, etc. No financing for your fossil fuels, not for their fossil fuels, because they don't depend on finance in the same sense. So,
Jairam, might be time to pivot to the question.
Yeah. So finance. So all of you have been discussing the finance gap. I think Kerry made it very clear when he was in India. It's all going to be private. Private equity is the way to go. And he told India very clearly that there is 3-4 trillions, he said, an amazing figure, available as private equity. So it's all going to be private equity. Even in adaptation, they are pushing private finance. It's going to be private equity, bankable projects, and debts that you have to repay with user charges, etc., when it comes to things like water, electricity, so on. So I'm not surprised by that, but I think these are the two things: a pincer movement on mitigation, and all finance dominated overwhelmingly by private finance. I think this is the thing we are looking at, and what we do about it will determine the way we will go. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jairam. Any of the panelists is welcome to respond to this. I would note that the
With due apologies, can I just say just one more thing? And this is particularly for Lavanya. We've been like Harold, a great admirer of our aphorism that India uses equity as a shield rather than a sword. For the first time in the closing plenary, India used it as a sword and not a shield. And I think it was a great advice. Thank you.
All right, we'll thank you. So I think we also have colleagues from WRI on the webinar, and I think if they would like to, very welcome for them to also get on and express their views. But I would also say that this point about weak targets that can be updated, in all fairness, I think that's not exactly a unique phenomenon to one group of countries. I mean, India moved pretty seamlessly from 33, 35 to 45% for the same year, and it's part of sort of the perhaps the game. But would anybody like to comment on Jayaraman's point?
Yeah, I mean, I think Jayaraman, we've known each other when working on equitable access for sustainable development many years ago in the lead up to the Durban COP. I completely agree with the analysis, but as it will be no surprise to you, I don't necessarily draw entirely the same conclusion. I think it's I completely share the analysis. I think that is what is happening. I think it's very astutely observed. But when I posted something in response in the Q&A, when I think about finance, so there the other part, the other worldview, there's a 2.1c worldview, which you very accurately described, and there's Article 9 and 9.3 worldview, which is developed countries shall provide, which is in the Paris Agreement records existing obligations of the convention. That is agreed. But I think as Lavanya, I think there's a significant step, I see a significant stepping back from those, or certainly a clear acknowledgement that has not been achieved, which is, to me, the conclusion that I draw is there are two narratives and two worldviews that are talking past each other here. And I think to move forward, if future COPs are not going to be like this one, where there is no deal on finance, and yet somehow there's this very unbalanced, if future COPs and global stock takes are going to move us forward, I think we need to find a way of having the conversation across those two worldviews. And I think that's a big challenge. I don't know how to do that, but that's a slightly different conclusion that I draw from the very valid analysis. Thanks.
Lavanya?
Thank you, Navroz, and thank you, Jayaraman, for that, for those great set of observations. Like Harold, I also agree with your analysis, but draw slightly different conclusions from them. But I'm going to speak to the issue, the pincer move between the NDCs and long-term strategies. Of course, it's not accidental, but I don't think that's a bad thing. As long as the pathways from the NDCs to the long-term strategies are well thought through, and there's sort of a fairly linear, or at least a clear pathway from the short-term NDCs through successive cycles of NDCs to the long-term strategy. The question, I think the questioning of the long-term strategies is not that there are long-term strategies in existence. The questioning is of their credibility, of their accountability, and of their fairness. And if there are mechanisms in place to ensure that those long-term strategies are credible, accountable, and fair, then they're certainly a good thing. And we should be able to chart pathways from current NDCs to those net zero targets. The challenge right now is that many of those net zero targets are taking the place of short-term ambition. So ambition in long-term strategies is taking the place of short-term ambition, and that's the real problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Lavanya. And I have to say, I sort of no surprise that I very much aligned with that view myself. It's I should out ourselves that Lavanya, Harold, and I wrote a piece for the conversation, sort of interrogating what it would take for these net zero targets to be credible, and that's very much the view. And certainly the risk that they, instead of complementing, that they substitute for short-term targets is really the fear. And I didn't see anything from Glasgow that convinced me that fear has entirely gone away. I do think it's interesting that the sort of these things are in the eyes of the beholder. So the Spencer movement, well, that is entirely the intent, is to actually sort of find ways of corralling countries to move along through something like this. I guess implicit in Jayaraman's question is whether that pincer applies with uneven pressure on the north versus the south. And that is, again, probably a fair question and something for us to think about. I am going to take sort of chair's privilege to now promote to the conversation, ask a question, Parth Bhatia. Full disclosure, he's a colleague here at CPR and a very valued one. So Parth, you had a nice question in the chat.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I just lost the written version of the question because I joined the panelist, but I'll just quickly say it out. My question is: are the panelists worried that the developing countries might lose their leverage to bring developed countries to the table as sort of the mitigation pledges increase? And also, we are seeing a lot of side deals happening on mitigation. So the EU-US steel-related deal, the South Africa coal sort of pledge, and then there's the whole Mark Carney Global Finance Alliance happening. So all of these things happening parallel, where does that leave the developing countries in terms of leverage and kind of the COP as a platform which remains useful over time? Thanks.
Yeah, I think I was particularly keen to have that question asked because I think we haven't, in fact, talked about all the side rings of the circus, in particular the finance deal and so on. It's very important. I also am glad Parth brought up the South Africa deal for finance because that's really significant and very much kind of in the air here in India. I will also say before I turn back to the panelists that India is in conversation with the World Bank to get a substantial amount of money for shutting down coal mines. So Jayaraman's point about the fact that this finance world is kind of sprouting Hydra-like in various ways, I think is probably apposite. Again, is that a bad thing? Given that publics in the West aren't likely to cough up that much. That's a normative question. But with that small addition, maybe we could have one quick round from the panel, and that's probably all we have time for, depending on how quick you all are. Would Mr. Rashmi like to go first on this?
Yeah, thank you so much, Navroj. I'll confine myself to this question of finance, how these finance flows can be actually aligned with the short-term NDC targets or the long-term strategy. It's really important. I mean, what bothers me is not the channel of finance, whether it is multilateral development banks or private capital or the government budgets of the developed countries. That's really that's important, but I think is not material as far as the final impact is concerned. That has to be done in a manner that it achieves the results of the NDCs which countries have put out. So the critical problem, the real problem there is not availability of resources or finance at the international or global level, but the cost of capital. So and we have to come up with innovative systems at the global level which bring down the cost of capital for the users of this capital, either in the private sector or in the public sector. That is what is actually holding up the entire process, and not the availability of resources. So I think the Green Climate Fund that we have set up, this model has failed. We need to do something on the lines of what the Montreal Protocol on ODS has done. We had a multilateral fund there, which provided resources and support to the industries in the developing countries for outputs on incremental basis. We need to do something like that to relate the finance to the outcomes in the wherever we want to employ green technologies and have desired outcomes. But along with this linkage between the outcomes and the finance, we need to introduce a mechanism which brings down the cost of this capital. The most of, when you raise bonds in the domestic sector or for any particular sector, if the bonds are B or B plus, the cost of capital rises. While the finance is available at 1.5 or 2% interest in the global financial system, when it actually lands with the user, it becomes 8%. So that is clearly becomes commercially unviable. So the challenge before us is to ensure that the international financial flows coming from whatever sources which are mandated under the Paris Agreement come at a commercially viable rate at which we can afford the financial cost of the capital and employ it profitably.
Thank you, Mr. Rashmi. Lavanya?
Thank you, Navroj. So I'm going to focus on the leverage part of the question and speak to, I think, 2 points here. In terms of leverage for developing countries, there is, and we see this even in the Glasgow Climate Pact, there's a final section 8 on collaboration. So there's a move towards diffusion of responsibilities and actions. Now, it could be seen as diffusion or it could be seen as inclusion, right? So you could talk about diffusion of responsibilities and actions. So there are multiple stakeholders that are sort of integrated into the system, and that could be a good thing or a bad thing, or it could be both. But in terms of actually leverage for developing countries in relation to developed countries, I think that equation does change when you have multiple stakeholders that are taking action, that are asked to take action, that are being given responsibilities, and increasingly the Paris Agreement architecture is including them in the conversation. Like I said, this could be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on the perspective that one takes. I think the second point in relation to leverage that I would make is there's also a move, and we see early signs of this, towards a discussion on sectors. And when we start discussing sectors, we're cutting across the developed developing country lines, right? So again, there's a sort of diffusion there of that, or blurring of those traditional lines, and therefore the sort of developing country dynamic and conversation does change when we start talking about taking actions in sectors across countries, whatever the status of those countries might be. So I think there is less leverage, and I think there are various sort of moves in the negotiations over the years that have resulted in this sort of decreased leverage, and we see that in the outcomes of the pact, the Glasgow Climate Pact, where there's such an imbalance that all of us have been speaking to. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Lavanya. Harold, any quick last words on this or something else, and then I'll wrap up. And,
Yes,
before you start, just to say that I promised you and Mr. Rashmi that you have to leave right on the half hour or the hour, depending on where you sit. So we'll be quick.
Very close. So I'll just pick up on since the South African coal issue was mentioned, just briefly give you a perspective and say, and it's just my personal opinion, not speaking on behalf of anyone. And I say that because my view is that South Africa has really missed out on mitigation finance. We really didn't have very many CDM projects. NAMAs were potentially funded, really none. And so I think this is a very good outcome for South Africa. It is not. Could invite you to a webinar for a South African discussion. There are quite mixed perceptions of this. And some of the concerns relate to what conditionalities might be attached, essentially, and then of course deep interests in coal, and I mean I don't mean here the companies, but also labor unions, and then a whole lot of domestic politics, which I will not go into here. My view is this will make can make a huge difference to South Africa. This, in South African terms, is about 130 billion South African rand. Our national utility, Eskom, has an existing debt of 400 billion. This puts Eskom into a much better financial position, even though it is more debt. These are concessional loans, not grants, or will be. But that just changes. The state-owned enterprises are the biggest single reason why South Africa as a country is junk rated by the international rating agencies, whatever one thinks of the demerits of that. That is where we are. And so now Eskom will have better chance of accessing capital markets. And there is an expectation that this leads to two things: an accelerated phase out of coal, although what exactly is in the offer is not that clear, and social justice. And by social justice, I mean that those communities and workers dependent on coal would find livelihoods elsewhere, and that is really important. The reason why I also feel that the critique, I don't agree with the critics, is that we have decided in our own terms that we want a just transition. We have established a presidential climate commission. As you know, you've done work on institution, a new institution that at the moment I would say is the most dynamic space in South Africa. And its main task is to oversee the just transition. And so I have confidence that South Africa can actually manage this funding and that it can make a big difference.
Thank you so much, Harold. I'm going to take just maybe 3 minutes or so to sum up, and if those of you who have other commitments need to leave, I'll fully understand. Well, not to sum up, but to maybe share some of my views. And Harold's last point is a very good kickoff point, which is that the domestic politics in South Africa has sort of shifted around a just transition for coal, and that has opened up all kinds of spaces, and the international linkage has started from the domestic and kind of bridge back up with this financing deal. I think that's an interesting model, and to my mind, the way in which things will transition will happen in most countries. The Paris Agreement kind of build out idea in Glasgow to put to use an America sort of this, if you build it, they will come. And now we built it, and we'll see if they come. And I think the answer rests really in what happens at the national level to pave the way to groups, to countries actually moving forward. We've talked a lot about the short run 2030 versus the long run, and this idea of kind of a pincer movement. And I share Lavanya's view that this is by design. We have to find all kinds of hooks and crannies and nudges to try and get countries there. But of course, we have to do it in a way that's fair, so that pressure of the pincer doesn't focus unevenly on one versus another. We talked about mitigation and adaptation. There is a hopeful note now on adaptation, because the way the Paris Agreement works, as Lavanya's many writings have taught us, it's about procedures, and you now have a procedure and a pathway set in place on adaptation. Harold pointed out it's only a 2-year pathway, but it's better than what came before. On loss and damage, I personally remain quite worried that not much more will happen, partly because of that sort of agreement way back when about with developed countries essentially ring fencing this question of liability. And so how do you get past that in a sense is something that I leave to the lawyers, but I'm very unclear on. Finance, I do think we are seeing this proliferation. We're going to see South Africa-like deals. We are going to see sort of various broker deals around private equity and tapping all the money sloshing around in pension funds in the US. And so what countries like the US might bring to the table is kind of persuading those who guard those purse strings to start looking at opportunities around low carbon mitigation. We're going to see the World Bank and multilaterals being nudged to be more engaged. And again, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it depends how pragmatic you are. If it's a question of principle that we have to see public monies and taxpayers in the richer countries paying, we may not see much action, frankly, because again, that's a question of politics. If we are pragmatic and we say, well, let's not worry so much if it's directly from taxpayers or indirectly so through the MDBs and so on, we may see more money flowing, but I think that's going to be creative. Article 6 is a great example of where we built the scaffolding. Let's see if the carbon markets are therefore more credible. And finally, on this question of coal, I tend to think that the phase out, phase down brouhaha won't make much difference for India. And India has really missed a trick, because instead of phasing out or phase down, we've done something much more significant. We've not built, right? That's better than phasing out or phase down, not to build it at all in the first place. And so I wonder whether diplomatically we needed to stick our neck out in this way, because symbolically for many countries, it's really important to phase out, to phase down for the small island states, the signal it sends to the industry, and so on and so forth. So to me, it is a little bit of an own goal, to put it somewhat bluntly. So that's just a couple of minutes from me trying to build on this great conversation. I just want to thank Harold, Mr. Rashmi, and Lavanya. Thank you to all the participants and the audience members and the questioners. And we'll see you certainly next year at the next debrief, but hopefully well before then. Thank you.
Thank
you very much, Navroz.
Thank you, Navroz. Thank you very much. And thanks, everyone. Thank you, Lavanya.
Thank you.
Bye,
Love you.
Aram.